I knew something was wrong the moment my son whispered, "Don't tell the neighbors you're my mother." He said it fast, without looking at me, his lips barely moving, as though the words themselves were shameful, something to be hidden beneath the polite noise of the suburban air. The man next door was watering his perfect lawn, smiling with a kind of lazy confidence that comes from people who never had to earn their comfort. I smiled back, because that is what you do when your own child asks you to pretend to be someone else. I stood there with the tin of raspberry scones I had baked the night before, the same ones Daniel used to devour as a boy when he came home from school, raspberry jam sticking to his fingers and chin, and I realized I was holding a relic from another life, something that no longer fit the furniture of his world. I am 77 years old, though I no longer say it out loud, because age has become a kind of accusation in polite company. I live alone now in a modest apartment in Portland, Oregon, surrounded by photographs of people who no longer remember the stories behind them. I had flown across the country to visit my son and his family in Connecticut, uninvited, but not entirely unwelcome, or so I had hoped. The flight was long and turbulent, and I spent most of it staring at the clouds, rehearsing small, safe sentences. How lovely the baby must be by now. How proud I was of him. How beautiful the house looked in the pictures he had sent. I thought that if I spoke softly enough, if I smiled in the right way, I might still belong. When the taxi pulled up to his street, I saw the kind of neighborhood that seems designed to make you feel like an intrusion. Every driveway held a car so new it looked borrowed from a commercial. Every window had the same immaculate curtains, every hedge trimmed with military precision. I recognized Daniel's house instantly. It had the same color palette as the man he had become, expensive, deliberate, and a little cold. The front door opened before I reached it. He looked older than I remembered, sharper around the jaw, his smile practiced, a little too smooth. Behind him, Carla appeared, holding a glass of wine and her phone like twin accessories. "Oh, you're here," she said, with that light surprise of someone faced with a guest who has arrived too soon. "We weren't sure which flight you were on." I told her I had texted the night before. She nodded vaguely, already turning back into the house, her voice drifting behind her like perfume. "We've got a full house this weekend. Neighborhood social tonight. Hope that's okay." Daniel took my coat and hung it in a narrow closet by the door. Not the main one, not the one with his and Carla's sleek jackets lined up like trophies. I realized he didn't know where guest things belonged, because he had never had a guest who wasn't there to impress. The living room was beautiful, I'll give them that. Cream-colored sofas, a glass coffee table with books that no one reads but everyone displays, and art that seemed chosen to match the walls rather than the soul. There were no pictures of Daniel as a boy, no family photos at all, only Carla's parents in Rome, Carla's sister in Manhattan, Carla's children from her first marriage. Not even a frame of the new baby with Daniel. I stood there in my travel clothes, feeling the weight of my coat still in my arms, though I wasn't holding it anymore. "Where should I put this?" I asked, lifting the tin of scones. "Oh, just leave it on the counter," Carla said, distracted. "We're doing gluten-free right now, but the kids might want some." The kids, hers, not ours, peeked in from the staircase, muttered a quick hello, then vanished upstairs. They didn't know me, had never called me Grandma. My own granddaughter, the baby, was asleep somewhere in a nursery that looked more like a designer showroom than a child's room. Daniel smiled too much, as if to compensate for the silence. "We'll show you to the guest room," he said, leading me down a hall that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and distance. The room was spotless and impersonal, the kind of space where nothing personal was meant to linger. On the nightstand, there was a small printed card with the Wi-Fi password written in elegant script. "Welcome, guests," it read. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my knees aching from the flight, and I felt the quiet of the house press around me. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind that hums with effort, the silence of people holding their breath so nothing looks out of place. Daniel hovered near the door, his phone lighting his face. "Just try to be relaxed tonight," he said. "It's mostly Carla's circle, doctors, architects, that kind of crowd." He said it as though warning me not to embarrass him. I smiled and nodded, the way mothers do when their sons forget who taught them grace. When he left, I looked around the room again. No books, no chair, no sign that anyone had prepared it with affection. Just clean sheets and that card, Thornhouse 1, the Wi-Fi password, which, cruelly enough, included her maiden name. My name was nowhere. I reached into my purse and touched the envelope I had carried all the way from Oregon, the original deed to the house. My name was still there, printed clearly above his. He had needed me to buy it. "It's just paperwork," he'd said back then, "just until I can refinance." I believed him, of course I did. I always believed him. I sold the last of my bonds, the ones I'd been keeping since my husband's death, and I wired the money to his account with the trembling hope that mothers always carry, the belief that helping is the same as belonging. I pressed the envelope flat in my lap and felt the faint raised texture of my signature. My name, my proof that once I had mattered enough to be written down. The next morning, the house was already awake by the time I came downstairs. Carla was making something green and frothy in a blender. Daniel stood by the refrigerator, scrolling through his phone. They didn't look up when I entered. "Morning," I said. "Morning," Daniel answered automatically, still reading whatever was on his screen. I poured myself a cup of coffee from the machine, one of those sleek chrome devices that hum like robots and dispense something thin that only pretends to be coffee. I sat at the counter and watched them move around each other with the choreographed efficiency of people who've practiced being perfect. "We're heading out soon," Carla said. "Farmer's market and then the park." "That sounds nice," I replied. "Maybe I'll take a walk around the neighborhood, stretch my legs." Daniel looked up. "You sure you're okay with that? It's a pretty upscale area. Just don't talk to anyone too long, okay?" He tried to sound casual, but there was a warning buried in it, the way there always is when a child starts treating their parent like an inconvenience. I tilted my head. Why would I? "No reason," he said quickly, glancing at Carla, who was slicing fruit with surgical precision. She didn't look up, but her shoulders stiffened just slightly. When they left, I stood alone in the silent kitchen. The refrigerator hummed. The air conditioner clicked. The baby monitor blinked. Everything in that house worked exactly as intended, except love. I walked through the rooms slowly, like a ghost checking if anyone remembered her name. The dining table gleamed without a single scratch. The shelves were lined with art books arranged by color, and every candle was unlit. I touched the edge of the mantel and felt the absence of photographs like a bruise. Not even one from Daniel's childhood. The toothless smile, the paper crowns, the school projects we'd done together. All erased. Upstairs, I could hear the faint cooing of the baby through a wall, the sound of new life that I had not been invited to nurture. I thought about the years I had given him, every double shift at the clinic, every bill paid, every apology made on his behalf when he was young and reckless and thoughtless, the years when love meant bailing him out quietly. And now here I was, a guest in the house I helped him buy, a stranger whose presence had to be managed. When I stepped outside into the yard later that morning, the sunlight hit the perfect blades of grass like glass. The neighbor waved again. I waved back, but this time I didn't smile. I just stood there, an old woman in sensible shoes, breathing in the sterile air of someone else's success, and realized that this was the reason he had never invited me. It wasn't the distance. It wasn't the schedule. It wasn't even Carla. It was shame. His, not mine. He had built a world where I did not fit, and now he was asking me to admire it quietly. The raspberries in the tin had already begun to soften, the sugar crust breaking down under the weight of travel and time. I left them on the counter untouched. He wouldn't eat them, I knew that now. They tasted too much like where he came from. That afternoon, the house smelled faintly of citrus and money, a polished kind of cleanliness that makes you afraid to touch anything for fear of leaving fingerprints. Carla had gone upstairs with the baby, and Daniel was in his office on a work call, speaking in a tone I had never heard from him before. Measured, confident, faintly condescending, the voice of a man who had learned how to perform success for people, who graded him on tone and posture. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of that bitter coffee, the one that tasted like pretense, and tried to remind myself that this was a visit, nothing more. A visit, a small window into his world, a chance to be part of it, if only for a weekend. I told myself that he was just distracted, that he didn't mean the things he said earlier, that he was under pressure and would soften when the house emptied out and we were alone. That is what mothers do. They invent reasons to forgive. But reason has a way of cracking when faced with repetition. When Daniel finally emerged from his office, his phone still in his hand, he asked if I wouldn't mind staying in that evening. Carla's hosting the neighborhood social downstairs, he said. It'll be mostly her crowd. Loud. You'd probably rather relax upstairs. I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could, Carla appeared behind him, her face framed by that careful smile she wore like an accessory. Yes, Marianne, she said sweetly. Please don't feel obliged to join us. We just don't want you to get tired. Tired, of course, is what people say when they mean invisible. I told her I would be fine, that I didn't tire easily, but she had already turned back to the counter, arranging canapes like a surgeon preparing for an operation. Later, while they fussed over wine glasses and playlists, I went upstairs to the guest room and sat at the edge of the bed. The sun was lowering outside, brushing the windows with a glow too soft for a house like this. I took the deed from my purse again, unfolded it slowly, and read my own name like it was an accusation. I remembered the day I signed it, how Daniel had clasped my hands in gratitude, calling me his rock, his foundation, saying he could never have done it without me. I remembered his face, open and young, not this guarded version that flinched at every trace of history. I pressed the paper flat on my lap and imagined what would happen if I showed it to one of those guests downstairs, told them whose money built their gleaming countertops. I imagined the shock, the embarrassment, the way Daniel's smile would crumble. But I also imagined the shame in myself, the smallness of the act. I didn't want revenge. I wanted truth to exist somewhere outside my head. The music began downstairs, a soft hum of laughter and conversation filtering through the air vents. I could hear Carla's voice rising occasionally, smooth and social. Every now and then, Daniel's deeper tone, measured and professional, followed by the familiar, polite laughter of people validating one another's importance. I sat still for a while. Then curiosity, or maybe loneliness, pulled me to the top of the staircase. From there, I could see just enough through the railing. The guests, the gleaming platters, the chandeliers lit like interrogation lamps. And there, In the center of it all, my son, gesturing toward the artwork on the wall, recounting the story of how they had found the piece at a gallery in Manhattan. It wasn't true. I knew where it came from. I had given him the money to buy it as a housewarming gift. But he didn't mention that. He said, Carla fell in love with it the moment she saw it. And Carla smiled and touched his arm, as if the truth had always been that simple. It was during that moment that one of the women, elegant, too tanned, wearing pearls that looked inherited from someone who'd actually earned them, asked Daniel if his family was coming for the holidays. He hesitated, barely a second, but enough for me to feel the pause like a crack in my ribs. We're keeping it small this year, he said. Just us and the kids. The woman nodded approvingly. Family time is sacred, she said. I stepped back from the railing before he could look up and see me. My legs trembled, not from age, but from restraint. I returned to the guest room, closed the door, and sat at the desk that wasn't meant for use. My reflection in the dark window looked older than I remembered. There's a peculiar cruelty in realizing that the person you raised would rather pretend you're gone. When the laughter died down and the house quieted again, I heard Carla's heels clicking across the floor, the clinking of glass being tidied, the faint murmur of good nights at the door. Then Daniel's voice, low and tired. She was watching from the stairs. A pause. Carla's sigh, practiced and dismissive. Well, that's uncomfortable. Another pause, heavier. We'll have to set boundaries, she added. I don't want this to become a thing. His answer was a murmur, indistinct, but it ended with, I'll handle it. The words drifted upstairs like smoke, poisoning the air before I even breathed them. The next morning, the world outside was gray and damp. Carla was already dressed, sleek and polished, the baby in her arms like an accessory, chosen to match her blouse. Daniel was by the counter, holding his travel mug, his phone in the other hand. We're heading out, he said. There's food in the fridge. I nodded. You'll be home for dinner? Late, he said. Maybe order something. He said it as if the house wasn't stocked with food I wasn't allowed to touch. They left, the door closing behind them with a sound that felt definitive. I stood there in the kitchen, staring at the spotless countertop, the two bright flowers in their white vase, the small mechanical blink of the coffee machine light. Everything was too clean, too precise, as though the house itself refused to admit that life was supposed to be messy. I don't know what exactly pushed me to do it. Maybe boredom, maybe instinct, maybe the simple need to know the truth without interpretation. I opened the door to the laundry room, the only space in the house that looked remotely human, with detergent bottles and a faint smell of fabric softener, and found a tall cabinet labeled Household. Inside were files stacked neatly, envelopes with tabs, utilities, insurance, mortgage. My hand hovered before I let it rest on a familiar beige folder, the one from the bank where we'd finalized the purchase. I pulled it out carefully, opened it on the washing machine lid, and there it was, my name, printed clearly, bold and legal, Marianne Cross. Underneath, his name, smaller, as secondary applicant. Nothing had changed. My ownership was intact. The mortgage was in both our names, but the down payment, my money, was recorded in full. I felt a strange mix of pride and nausea. Pride, because I had not imagined it. Nausea, because I understood now why he avoided me. My existence was an inconvenient reminder that he hadn't built his success alone. I slid the folder back where it belonged and closed the cabinet, wiping my hands on my skirt as if to erase fingerprints. I stood there a long while, listening to the hum of the washer, and I realized something that startled me with its calmness. I didn't want to fight for a place in that house anymore. I wanted to understand why I had begged for it in the first place. I had raised a man who thought money erased origins, who believed gratitude was a weakness. That wasn't entirely his fault. I had trained him to rise, to reach, to never look down, even if what he was stepping over was me. By afternoon, they returned with shopping bags and laughter. I was sitting in the living room, reading, or pretending to, when Daniel came in. He looked surprised to see me downstairs. "You didn't go out?" he asked. "No," I said. "I explored enough." He hesitated, sensing something in my tone. Carla came in behind him and placed a hand on his arm. "Mom," she said, using the word like it cost her something, "we were thinking. You've been so independent all these years. Maybe you'd be more comfortable at a nearby hotel for the rest of your stay, just so you can relax properly, have room service, a bit of privacy." The phrasing was perfect, rehearsed. I looked at her, then at my son, and waited for him to object. He didn't. He just rubbed his neck and muttered something about convenience. My throat burned, but I smiled. "That's thoughtful," I said. "I'll think about it." That night, I didn't sleep. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the thermostat. I got up, dressed quietly, and went to the window. Outside, the streetlights painted everything in the same indifferent shade. I could see the neighbor's porch, the swing, the tidy bushes. I thought of how Daniel had told me not to speak to them too long, as though conversation were contagious. I thought of the guests downstairs, their perfect laughter, and the way my name had not been spoken once. And then, for the first time in years, I felt something break cleanly inside me. Not like despair, but like clarity. Before dawn, I packed my bag. I left the tin of scones on the kitchen table, uncovered. I wrote a note on a napkin. "They're still good if you warm them slightly." I tucked the deed into my purse, zipped it shut, and slipped out of the house. The air was cool and smelled faintly of rain. I didn't know exactly where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay where I wasn't allowed to exist. I walked down the street slowly, my knees stiff but steady, the houses lined up like teeth, each one guarding its secret. Behind me, Daniel's house stood silent, perfect, untouched by the absence of the woman who had built it. I turned the corner without looking back. That was the moment I understood. Being erased is not the same as being gone. Sometimes disappearance is the only honest way to be seen. I walked until the sky lifted from pewter to the dull pearl of morning, and the bakery on the corner switched its sign from closed to open with a soft click that felt gentler than anything I had heard in days. And I stood there a moment to test my own. Resolve, because leaving a house is easy when it is dark and no one can question you, but staying gone is harder when the air begins to smell like yeast and coffee, and the city shows you the ordinary kindness of a door that swings inward without suspicion. So I went in with my small suitcase, bumping my calf, and ordered plain coffee and a toasted roll, speaking in the voice I use when I don't wish to be noticed. And the girl behind the counter asked if I wanted the senior discount in the same cheerful tone she would use to ask for my name on a cup. And I said yes, not because I am fragile, but because I have finally learned to take what is quietly offered without apologizing for it. I sat near the window and watched the street begin its day, and when my phone began to vibrate, I knew, without seeing the screen, that the night had ended inside that perfect house, and that absence had found its way into Daniel's morning like a stain that would not buff out, and I let it buzz once, twice, 3 times before I picked it up, because sometimes the only power left to a person is the refusal to hurry. His first message was the kind a manager sends to a subordinate who has missed a meeting. "Where are you, Mom?" And before I could answer, another came, a softened repetition dressed as concern. "Everything okay?" And then Carla's entry in that clipped sweetness she wears like a silk scarf, pretty from a distance and suffocating up close. "We booked a room for you at the courtyard by the highway for the next 2 nights, so you can rest. Daniel will drive you over after breakfast. Please don't wander. The neighborhood, the HOA, is very particular about loitering. We'll pick up your bag at noon." Okay. I stared at the message a long time and realized that the word loitering held me like a hand on the back of my neck. Not hard enough to bruise, not gentle enough to forget, simply positioned to remind me that in their minds, an old woman on a sidewalk is not a mother, not a co-owner, but a potential problem. And I put the phone face down as if I could dim their power by depriving them of my eyes. I found a modest inn 3 blocks away where the carpet was clean in the way of spaces that are used by people who live simply, and the clerk slid a key across the counter without insisting on the artificial intimacy of small talk, which felt to me like a gift I hadn't known to ask for. And in the room I set my suitcase on the rack and stood a moment listening to the hum of the heater, thinking how sometimes the only proof you exist is the way an appliance changes the air for you. And I made the small bed and smoothed the corner the way I used to do for Daniel when he was a boy with sweaty hair and stubborn knees. And then, because I am a practical woman, even in the middle of a humiliation, I took the deed from my purse and photographed each page carefully, aligning the edges with the calm of a nurse laying out instruments, and I emailed the images to myself with a subject line so plain it felt like a prayer. House papers, proof, because it occurred to me that truth should never again be trusted to a single drawer in a house where I am called a guest. When I stepped back into the hallway, I felt lighter, not happy, not triumphant, but stabilized, like a table whose wobble has finally been found and shimmed. And I decided to walk to the library because a building full of spines has always steadied mine. And on the way, a neighbor lifted a hand to stop me with the careless entitlement of a man who manages volunteers, and he asked if I was the new cleaner, and if I could please not park on the cul-de-sac during the cocktail hour because the valet gets confused. And I said I was only passing through, and he laughed in that way people do when they think you have made a joke that confirms their sense of the world. And I walked on with the knowledge that every assumption here had already been assigned a seat while I was still at the door. At the library, I asked for a computer as if I were asking for permission to breathe. And the woman at the desk, gray braid, efficient hands, the kind of face that has seen every variety of human unraveling and learned not to flinch, gave me a 30-minute pass and pointed to a row of monitors with a gesture that said, "Go on then. Make your life a little larger if you can." And I sat and typed the bank's name and the parcel number and the county records into the search box, not because I doubted my memory, but because memory is dismissed easily by people who prefer documents to mothers. And in 3 clicks, there it was, my name resting calmly beside his in a font that had no reason to lie. And I printed the summary, even though the librarian warned me there was a fee per page, and I paid it with coins that clicked in the tray like punctuation. And I slid the printout into my purse next to the deed, as if I were tucking a child in beside another child, and I exhaled for the first time since the curb outside Daniel's house where the hydrangeas were too blue to be believed. In the children's section, a toddler shrieked with the joy of discovery, and I startled because I had forgotten that small people sometimes shout, not out of anger, but because their bodies are too small for their happiness. And I stood there feeling foolish for a moment before I realized my hands were shaking, not with fear, but with the tremor of someone who has finally placed a palm against the cool tile of a fact. When I stepped outside, it was near noon, and the street had warmed to a temperate anonymity, and my phone had filled with messages that tried to build a story while I wasn't looking, which is how small tyrannies work. Daniel asked if I had taken my medication, a question he had never once asked me before, and Carla asked again about the hotel in a tone that positioned generosity like a leash. And then a new text from an unknown number informed me in the voice of bureaucracy that any legal or financial inquiries regarding the Thorn Street property should henceforth be directed to Daniel Harlow as primary resident, which made me laugh right there on the sidewalk in a burst that turned a passing dog's head, because even the people who boss furniture around with white gloves sometimes forget that houses are not just coordinates, but choices, and the choices have long memories. I did not answer any of them, not because I wanted to be cruel, but because silence was the only language I had left that they could not edit. And I bought a small notebook from the pharmacy with a cover the color of late blueberries and a pen that writes like a good violin bow, and I began a list with the plainness of a woman who has learned that an inventory can be a kindness. Things I know, things I will not do again, things that belong to me even when I am not welcome. The first entry under things I know was that humiliation rarely arrives with fanfare. It comes in the curated voice of a text message about convenience, in the way a front closet is not opened for your coat, in the neighbor's friendly mistake that still places you below the furniture, and it gathers its strength, not from one act, but from repetition. So the second entry under things I will not do again was I will not explain the arithmetic of my sacrifices to people who have decided that math is impolite when performed in front of guests. And the first entry under things that belong to me was my name on a line in a county record and my right to be unembarrassed by it. As I walked back toward the inn to rest my knees, I passed Daniel's street out of some compulsion I can only call foolish, and I told myself I would not stop. I would keep my eyes on the cracked seam in the sidewalk like a pilgrim avoiding the holy sights. But habit is not obedience. It is simply a path. When I reached his house, my feet paused as if they had found a familiar tread on a staircase, and I recognized, to my annoyance, the ache that comes from wanting to see the shape of a wound even after the knife has been wiped clean. I did not go to the door. I am not reckless. I stood across the street and looked at the smart doorbell that answered before you knocked. And without meaning to, I lifted a hand as if I were hailing a taxi, and the small black eye blinked awake, and a polite male voice said, "Can I help you?" And though no curtain moved, I felt the neighborhood turn its head, and I lowered my hand and said, "No, thank you." And the device said, "Have a nice day," in a tone that felt like obedience training. Back at the inn, the clerk slid a takeout menu under the glass and said nothing, which I appreciated, and I sat on the bed with the blue notebook open and the deed beside me, and I thought about the idea of escalation because people imagine it as shouting and slammed doors and names thrown like plates. But this was different and perhaps more dangerous, a weather system of small pressures arranged to make me smaller still. They had changed the story of my visit from a mother seeing her son to a tired guest who did not understand boundaries. They had shifted the conversation from gratitude to liability, from kinship to risk management, and beneath each polite sentence, a quieter one pulsed, "Do not belong where we are visible. In the late afternoon, my phone chimed again, and I almost ignored it until the preview showed a photo I had not seen in years. Daniel, at 9, with a paper crown and a gap where his front teeth should be, his eyes bright with the seriousness of a child who believes birthday wishes are legally binding, and the message below the photo read from Carla's number in Daniel's voice. "Do you remember this cake? Mom, you always made too much. We'd love to have you bake something simple for the kids. Tomorrow, if you feel up to it, maybe stay upstairs until dessert, and then we'll bring you down. It would mean a lot." And I sat there stunned by the ingenuity of it, how they had found a way to convert my history into a service, to use remembrance as a doorbell that only opened inward, and I typed a careful yes, because the first escalation is not the time to shout. It is the time to observe how the stage is being set. In the evening, I walked to a grocery where the fruit was priced like jewelry, and the flour came in bags with fonts designed to reassure the anxious rich. And I bought what I needed and what I could carry. And back at the inn, I used the small communal kitchenette that smelled like last week's soup to mix batter in a bowl that wobbled, and the rhythm of it sent my thoughts into a calmer order. Because baking is the opposite of gaslighting. It rewards exactness and punishes fantasy. And when the cake finally cooled on a rack that had lost a foot, I wrapped it in wax paper with the care of a nurse bandaging something that will heal if left alone, and I placed it in the minibar to keep the butter calm. I slept badly, not because the bed was poor, but because the body remembers an old posture of vigilance, and at dawn I wrote a letter in the blue notebook addressed to no one and everyone. You may not enter a house carrying a woman's erasure and call it hospitality, and I tore it out and folded it and tucked it under the elastic band at the back like a secret spine. When I delivered the cake the next morning, I left it on the stoop because I had decided not to darken their doorbell eye again, and I texted Carla, on the porch, warmth at 300 for 10 minutes, because if I am to be used, I will at least choose the terms of my usefulness. And 5 minutes later, my phone chimed with a thank you and a smiley face so bare it felt like a sticker on a scraped knee. And another message followed, gentler, almost intimate. We'll leave a key for you on the side gate so you can pop in after lunch and rest in the guest room if you like. Just please don't tidy the kitchen. The cleaning crew comes at 2, and I felt the escalation settle into place like a lid. I was welcome, but only in a corridor that led to a chair facing a wall. I was included, but only as background music set low enough that conversation needn't stop. And the realization struck me with its newness and its age that nothing here would explode. Instead, I would be gradually dissolved, an old sugar cube in cool tea, sweetening a room that refused to admit I had ever been solid. I closed my eyes and let the image pass, and when I opened them, I could see the next step, forming not in rage, but in a kind of clean light. If I was going to be a ghost in a house I helped buy, then I would also be a witness with documents, a woman with a notebook, a quiet edge of truth that would not be sanded down by someone else's tasteful life. I woke before dawn to the sound of rain thickening against the window, the kind of steady private sound that makes a person feel suspended between one life and the next. The clock on the nightstand glowed 5:42, and for a moment I could not tell if I was in my own room in Portland or still inside the sterile hush of the guest suite in Daniel's house. But then I remembered the faint smell of disinfectant from the hallway and the way the radiator clicked like an old heart starting over. And I realized I was still at the inn, still technically visiting, though no one had asked me to come back. I lay there thinking about the cake I had left on the porch the day before, wondering if they had eaten it together, if the children had tasted it without being told where it came from, if my son had remembered the way his small hands used to tremble when he tried to crack eggs beside me on a Sunday morning, and I decided that it didn't matter anymore because memories that are not shared eventually harden into artifacts, and I was tired of curating a museum for people who pretended not to have lived in it. When the sky began to pale, I got up, made weak coffee on the little hot plate, and sat at the small desk that wobbled whenever I leaned too far. I opened the blue notebook again, the one that had become a kind of map through this half-life, and I wrote a single sentence in a calm, deliberate hand. I am no longer asking to be remembered. I am deciding to exist. The words startled me by their steadiness, because I had spent decades confusing visibility with love, thinking that if someone saw me clearly, they would inevitably cherish me. But I was beginning to understand that some people only look in order to measure what they can take. The rain deepened, and for a while I listened to it move across the street like a slow broom. I thought about calling a cab to the airport, buying a ticket to anywhere that didn't remind me of Daniel's polished silence. But instead, I reached for the folder of documents I had printed at the library and laid them across the bed in careful order. My name gleamed up from each page, not in the sentimental way of an inscription in a photo album, but in the factual clarity of ink that cannot be erased without leaving evidence. It gave me a strange courage, not the cinematic kind that swells inside music, but the quiet conviction that dignity is often nothing more than documentation and follow-through. At 9, I went back to the library, my umbrella bending in the wind, and as I entered the warmth, I felt a pulse of belonging so sudden it almost embarrassed me. The woman with the gray braid looked up from the circulation desk and nodded in the way of people who recognize another soul in exile. "You're back," she said. "Yes," I replied. "I need a computer again." She pointed to the same row and said, "You know where everything is." That simple sentence made my throat tighten because it had been a long time since anyone had spoken to me as if I were capable of knowing where things are. I spent the next 2 hours reading about property rights, about co-ownership, about the subtle distinctions between equity and possession. The language was dense and cold, but I found rhythm in it, a logic that asked for nothing emotional from me. By the time I printed out a new set of pages, my hands no longer trembled. When I stood to leave, the librarian asked if I needed a bag for the papers, and I said no, I would carry them. I wanted the world to see a woman holding proof. Outside, the clouds began to split open in pale strips, and the air smelled faintly of wet asphalt and possibility. I stopped by a small bakery near the corner, the kind that sold real bread with uneven crusts, and I bought a roll and ate it slowly at a table by the window. Across the street was a storefront for a community legal clinic, and on the glass door a sign read, "Walk-ins welcome," and I realized I had been walking in circles around my own permission for too long. I finished the roll, brushed the crumbs from my lap, and went in. The waiting area was small, furnished with plastic chairs and a coffee maker that looked as if it had lived many lives. The receptionist, a young man with tired eyes and the patience of someone who had learned how to listen, asked if I had an appointment. "No," I said, "but I think I need to understand something before it disappears." He smiled politely and handed me a form, and as I filled it out, writing my name again in block letters, I felt the strangeness of the moment, how the same hand that had signed her son's mortgage now trembled only slightly while reclaiming her right to be a person. When the lawyer called me in, she was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s, with hair pulled back into a sensible knot, and eyes that were both kind and unwilling to flatter. I explained my situation plainly, without apology, the way a nurse reports a symptom she already knows is serious. I told her I had co-signed a house with my son, that he now wished to erase me from its story, that he had changed locks not yet, but perhaps soon, and that I needed to know what power a mother still had when sentiment was no longer currency. She listened carefully, taking notes in long, deliberate lines, and when I finished, she said, "Legally, you have standing. Emotionally, I can't advise you. But if you wish, I can file a simple notice of shared ownership with the county so that no sale or refinance can occur without your signature." I nodded, feeling my pulse steady, and asked what it would cost. "Nothing today," she said, "just your identification." I handed it over, and when she photocopied it, I saw my own face under the harsh fluorescent light and thought it looked almost unfamiliar, as if dignity itself had altered my features. When I left the office, the sun had broken through, and the sidewalk glittered with the delicate bravery of puddles. I stood for a long moment breathing the air, realizing that the shift had already occurred. It wasn't about revenge or exposure. It was about returning my life to my own custody. The act of filing that notice, small as it was, rethreaded something inside me. I thought of all the years I had spent managing other people's chaos, Daniel's debts, Derek's illnesses, the neighbors' endless needs, and how none of them had ever asked if I wanted to be cared for in return. For the first time, I did not feel the hunger to be thanked. I felt the solid warmth of self-respect, an emotion that does not glitter, but endures. I took a bus back to the inn, watching the houses roll past, their lawns glistening, their blinds drawn in perfect unison. When the bus stopped near the park, I stayed seated a moment longer, because through the window I could see a small boy with dark curls and a red kite, his father kneeling beside him. And though I could not hear their words, the rhythm of their gestures told me everything: the patience, the slight frustration, the pride disguised as instruction. And I felt a sudden, overwhelming tenderness, not for my son, but for the child he used to be, the one who would look over his shoulder to see if I was watching. I whispered to the glass, "I was always watching." And the reflection that looked back at me was calm. That evening, back in the room, I brewed tea and opened the notebook again. I wrote about the day, not as complaint, but as evidence. Then, without quite deciding to, I took out a small envelope from my purse, the photo I had found years ago of Daniel at 7, holding a toy stethoscope to his father's chest, both of them laughing, and I slid it between the pages of the notebook, sealing it there as if into an archive. I realized that this act, small and domestic, was the ceremony of release I had been waiting for. The past would not vanish, but it would live under my custody now, not theirs. When night fell, I called the librarian's number from the card she had slipped into my papers. She answered, surprised. "You left your umbrella," she said. "It's here by the desk." I told her I would come by tomorrow. "No hurry," she said. "It's safe with me." That sentence, "safe with me," echoed in the quiet of the room, filling it with a warmth that didn't need walls. I realized then that belonging was not about invitation, but about recognition. I had been searching for safety in the wrong direction, trying to fit into houses that erased me, when safety was a small umbrella left in a library, a document filed under my name, a stranger who remembered my face. I turned off the lamp, lay back, and listened to the rain return. For the first time since stepping into Daniel's house, I did not feel like something left behind. I felt like something finally moving forward, one steady page at a time. The morning after the library called about my umbrella, I woke with a restlessness that felt sharper than the mild triumph I had carried the night before. The rain had ended, but the air still hung heavy with that metallic scent of streets drying over the ghosts of puddles. The television in the lobby murmured about markets and politics while the coffee machine hissed, and I realized how far the world continued to move without me. Yet for the first time in weeks, that motion no longer frightened me. I decided to walk the 1.5 miles to the library instead of taking the bus. I needed to feel my body reclaim distance. Each step along those wet sidewalks reminded me that movement, however small, was still a kind of choice. I thought of how Daniel once ran ahead of me when he was small, fearless, and impatient, turning to make sure I was following. It seemed fitting that now it was I who needed to keep walking without waiting for him to turn back. At the library door, the gray-braided woman smiled and handed me my umbrella with both hands, as though returning something sacred. "You left it on purpose," she said softly, and I laughed before realizing she was not entirely joking. "Maybe I did," I said, and she nodded as if she already knew. I told her I had filed the property notice, and she said she was glad that sometimes the only way to stay visible is to leave a paper trail the living can't rewrite. Her words felt like a benediction. I asked if I could sit for a while, and she gestured toward the reading room. There, surrounded by the muffled rustle of pages, I began writing a letter, not to Daniel, but about him, a letter that would exist without expectation of being read. I wrote that I had stopped mistaking love for gratitude, that I understood now how some people repay debt by pretending it never existed, that I no longer needed to be the mother who waited for a call to justify her usefulness. The letter grew longer than I expected, the ink deepening as if pressed by old veins of truth. By noon, I folded the pages, sealed them in an envelope, and wrote no name on the front. The librarian passed by, glanced at it, and said, "You look lighter," and I told her maybe that was the weight of not being polite. On my way back toward the inn, my phone vibrated. It was Daniel. The name alone brought a familiar tightening in my chest, as if an invisible belt had been pulled one notch closer. I considered ignoring it, but then I answered, because ignoring him would make me feel like the kind of person he imagined me to be. Fragile, avoidant, incapable of confrontation. His voice came through strained but controlled. "Mom," he began, "we need to talk about the house thing. Carla found something online, some filing with your name." I said yes, calmly, that I had simply confirmed the truth that was already there. There was a pause so dense I could almost hear his jaw tighten. "Why would you do that?" he asked, as if I had committed an indecency. "Because it's my house too," I said. His tone sharpened. "It was, years ago. We agreed it was just temporary. I refinanced. I told him the document said otherwise." "That's not the point," he snapped. "The point is how this looks." That sentence, "how this looks," landed with the familiar chill of everything that had ever mattered to him more than decency. I said I didn't care how it looked, that truth has its own appearance. He sighed heavily. "Carla's upset. She says this could complicate things if we decide to move." "Complicate," I repeated, tasting the word as though it were a stone. "You mean expose." He said my name once, sharply, as if trying to reassert hierarchy, then softer, almost pleading. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. You can't keep living in the past." I wanted to tell him that he was the one trapped in performance, that every gesture of his adulthood was an audition for people whose applause he would never hear. But I simply said, "The past is not my prison. It's your foundation." He hung up without another word. For the rest of the afternoon, I wandered through the city without aim, not lost, but untethered. I bought a second notebook because the first one had nearly filled, and as I wrote, The words came less like confession and more like observation, as though I were recording the life of another woman who happened to share my skin. When dusk fell, I returned to the inn, and the clerk handed me an envelope that must have arrived while I was gone. Inside was a note from Daniel written in his quick, managerial handwriting. We need to resolve this quietly. Let's meet tomorrow morning at the house, 10 a.m. Please come alone. No warmth, no pretense, only command. I placed the note on the desk, smoothed it with my palm, and understood that this was not an invitation, but a summons. The kind a person sends when they mistake inheritance for ownership. That night, sleep would not come. I kept hearing his voice saying, "How this looks," and I thought about how appearance had replaced morality in his vocabulary, how he had built a life made of surfaces so polished that reflection itself became a weapon. Around 2 a.m., I rose, dressed, and sat by the window watching the empty street. A fox crossed the intersection, thin and deliberate, vanishing into the hedge line as if returning to some unlit world that did not require permission. I whispered, "Take me with you," and smiled at the absurdity of it. But something inside me shifted with that small wish. I knew that the next day would not simply be a conversation. It would be the moment when the quiet war became visible. When I arrived at the house, Carla opened the door before I could knock. Her smile was tight enough to split. "Daniel's in the office," she said, stepping aside as if my presence carried static. The air smelled of lemon and tension. I walked down the hall, the same hall where I had once felt invisible, and found my son behind his desk. The deed, my copy, lay on the table between us. "Where did you get this?" he asked, though he already knew. "From the file you kept in your laundry cabinet," I said. His eyes flicked up, startled, then narrowed. "You went through our private papers?" "Our papers," I corrected. He exhaled sharply. "This is getting out of hand." I wanted to laugh but didn't. "Out of whose hand, Daniel?" I asked. "Yours?" He rubbed his forehead, the gesture of a man performing fatigue. "Mom, I'm just trying to keep things simple." "You mean clean," I said. "So no one sees the dirt." Carla entered then, holding her phone like a witness holding evidence. "We talked to a lawyer," she said briskly. "He said you might not be competent to handle complex financial documents anymore, given your age." Her tone was careful, falsely kind. I felt my pulse slow, not quicken, because the cruelty was no longer subtle. "Are you suggesting I'm incapable of reading my own name?" I asked. "Of course not," she said. "But sometimes people your age misremember arrangements. We're just trying to protect you." "From what?" I asked. "From embarrassment," Daniel said quietly. And there it was, the same wordless shame that had haunted every visit, now spoken aloud. I looked at both of them, at the house gleaming with its curated serenity, and I felt something inside me go still. "You want to erase me legally," I said. Daniel leaned back, spreading his hands as though calming a patient. "We want to make things clear. It's better for everyone if property issues are clean." "Better for whom?" I asked. "For us," he said finally. The honesty, so accidental, was almost beautiful. "I understand," I said. "Then I'll make things clear too." I reached into my bag, pulled out the county notice, and placed it on his desk. "You can't sell, transfer, or refinance without my consent. You wanted clarity? Now you have it." Carla's face drained of color. Daniel's jaw tightened. "This isn't over," he said. "No," I replied. "It's just finally beginning." I turned and walked out before he could answer. Outside, the sunlight felt too clean, like a stage light revealing every imperfection. I walked to the park and sat on a bench, the paper heavy in my lap. I should have felt victorious, But what I felt instead was grief, vast and oddly impersonal, as if mourning not a son, but a version of him that had died quietly years ago without my noticing. That evening, the first calls started. Unknown numbers, polite voices asking about my situation, insurance updates, medical check-ins that I hadn't requested. Someone had begun a campaign of concern, the kind that leaves no fingerprints. By nightfall, an email arrived from an estate attorney I didn't know, requesting confirmation of my cognitive state for a routine assessment. I laughed, then cried, then laughed again. They were trying to build a case that I was unfit, that my clarity was a symptom, that the price of being right at my age was suspicion. I called the lawyer from the clinic, told her everything. She listened silently and then said, "Don't engage. They're testing your threshold. Document everything. And if you receive anything in writing, forward it to me." I thanked her and hung up, my hands steady again. Over the next week, the pattern intensified. Small harassments disguised as care, a social worker showing up at my door on behalf of a concerned family member, a bank call verifying unusual activity, even a note slipped under my door that said in shaky cursive, "It's not too late to make peace." I realized then that the second battle of my life had begun, not the one for property, but for narrative. They were rewriting me as frail, delusional, a danger to myself. And the only antidote to that kind of erasure is truth told without apology. I kept every letter, recorded every call, filed them neatly with dates and times. The librarian helped me notarize a brief statement asserting my mental competence, signed by 2 witnesses from the clinic. It was the most elegant revenge imaginable, bureaucracy used as self-defense. One afternoon, as I returned from the library, a car slowed beside me. Daniel. He rolled down the window. "Mom, please get in. We need to talk." I shook my head. "I've said what I needed to." His voice cracked slightly. "You're making a mistake." I looked at him and saw, for the first time, fear rather than arrogance. "Maybe," I said. "But it's mine to make." He reached for something in the passenger seat, a photo album, I realized. He opened it, held up a page of our old family pictures. "This is what I'm trying to protect," he said. I stared at those faces, at my younger self smiling beside a boy who believed the world was fair. "Then you should have protected it when you still could," I said, and walked away. That night, in my room, I unpacked all the documents and laid them out across the bed like a constellation. Each page, each signature was a point of light in the dark map of my life. I realized that I was not fighting to win, but to remain visible, to stand unblurred in the record of things. The storm outside began to rise, branches brushing the window, thunder muttering its low agreement. I picked up my pen and wrote one final entry in the second notebook. They may call it defiance, but it's only clarity that has finally learned to speak in its own language. Then I closed the book, turned off the lamp, and listened to the rain. Resume, louder, fuller, like applause from some invisible audience that had been waiting all along for me to stop whispering and stand. I woke to a strange stillness that felt like the air before a verdict, heavy but expectant, and for a long moment I simply lay there, watching the pale light move across the ceiling of the small room, tracing lines that looked almost deliberate, as if the day itself had made a decision before I had even risen. I knew what I had to do. I had known for weeks, though I kept pretending the idea was too drastic, too final. the kind of act that belongs to other women in stories who are braver or angrier than I was. But courage is often quieter than its reputation. It doesn't shout, it arranges documents, it books appointments, it keeps time. I got up, dressed carefully in my best navy dress, the one that had traveled with me through funerals and interviews and birthdays, and I brushed my hair until it looked like intention instead of habit. I packed my notebooks, the deed, the notarized statements, and the letter I had written but never addressed. When I looked at my reflection, I did not look kind or maternal or small. I looked exact, and that was enough. The bus ride to the courthouse took 40 minutes. I watched the city slide by, those anonymous rows of lives that do not know they are scenery, and I thought about how many women of my age sit on these seats with folders on their laps, invisible armies of caretakers and co-signers and quiet, guarantors who have held together generations without ever signing their names on anything visible. The courthouse steps were slick with last night's rain. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant, that institutional mix of memory and bureaucracy. At the clerk's counter, I handed over the stack of forms. The young woman there looked through them with the efficient politeness of someone trained to handle emotions like they were part of the paperwork. "So you're filing for a partial property release to a third-party trust?" she asked. "Yes," I said, "in my name." She nodded, stamped each page with a sound that felt final in a way no argument ever could. "Once it's processed, ownership will transfer according to your instruction. Do you wish to notify the co-owner?" "Not yet," I said. "He'll learn soon enough." I left the courthouse lighter than when I had entered. The sky had cleared to a hard blue that made the edges of everything too distinct. I walked without a destination, past shop windows and bus stops, until I reached a small cafe with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard sign that promised refuge more than coffee. Inside, I ordered a sandwich and sat by the window. The envelope with the trust papers lay beside my plate, a small, deliberate shape. I thought of the women who had once surrounded me, my mother, my friends from the hospital, the neighbors I used to gossip with on summer evenings before our bodies began to betray us. Most of them gone now, their stories reduced to polite mentions in other people's sentences. I thought of how easily a life could disappear between forms. That was why I had chosen the Community Housing Fund, why my share of the house would go not to Daniel or to his perfectly curated family, but to a program that offered homes to women starting over after eviction or divorce or worse. I wanted the walls my money had built to finally hold someone who needed shelter, not status. I spent the afternoon in that cafe, writing my final letter, this time addressed directly to Daniel. I began without anger, because anger always made him defensive. But as I wrote, the tone hardened into something cleaner, like a blade that has been polished too long to stay soft. I told him I had filed the transfer, that my part of the house now belonged to people who would never ask anyone to hide where they came from. I told him he could keep his surfaces, his curated quiet, his performance of goodness, but that the foundation he had tried to erase would no longer hold him. I reminded him of the first house we ever lived in, the one with the leaky roof and the cracked porch, how we had painted the kitchen ourselves because we couldn't afford a professional, how he had insisted on yellow because he said it looked like sunlight you could eat. I wrote that the color had faded, as all colors do, but the memory of the brush in our hands had not. You built your adulthood on the belief that erasure equals refinement, I wrote. But what you've done is paint over warmth with cold light. I wish you peace with it. I do not wish you shame. Shame has been our family currency long enough. By the time I finished, the cafe was empty except for the barista wiping tables. I sealed the envelope, left a tip that felt symbolic, and stepped back into the street. Evening had arrived unnoticed, that thin metallic hour when the world looks neither alive nor asleep. I walked to the post office and dropped the letter into the box. It made a soft sound as it landed, unremarkable but irreversible. I stood there a moment, my hand still hovering over the slot, feeling the pulse of what I had just done. People passed behind me talking, laughing, carrying groceries, each of them unaware that the woman in the navy dress had just redrawn the map of her life. When I returned to the inn, the clerk handed me a message. Daniel had called. He said it was urgent. For a second, I considered ignoring it, but some old muscle of motherhood moved in me, that instinct to face the pain before it grows claws. I called him back. His voice was sharp, unsteady. "What have you done?" he demanded. "You think this fixes anything? You think this makes you noble?" I said nothing. "Do you know what this means for me?" he continued. "For Carla, for our credit, for the kids?" I told him calmly that he would manage, as he always had. "You can't just," he started and then stopped, perhaps realizing that I already had. There was a pause, the long silence of realization, and then he said, almost softly, "You really hate me that much?" That sentence, more than any of his fury, broke something tender inside me. "No," I said. I just finally stopped confusing silence with love. Then I hung up. I did not expect to cry, but the tears came quietly, not from guilt or sorrow, but from release. They came for the years of swallowing my own voice, for every dinner where I laughed at jokes that cut me, for every photo where I stood slightly behind the others so I wouldn't cast a shadow. I let them fall without wiping them away. The room blurred, then cleared, and when it cleared, I saw my life waiting, small but intact. I spent that night sorting my belongings, keeping only what could fit into a single suitcase. The rest I left neatly folded for the innkeeper, along with a note, for whoever needs a start. The next morning I woke to sunlight that looked new, though it was the same light that had always been there. I packed, dressed, and walked one last time past Daniel's street. The house stood immaculate as ever, its blinds drawn, its garden trimmed to obedience. A delivery truck idled in the driveway. I watched as the driver carried a box marked storage. I imagined Daniel inside, pacing, perhaps rereading the letter, perhaps tearing it apart. I did not feel triumph. I felt distance, the kind that does not wound but clarifies. Before leaving, I took the photograph from my wallet, the one of him as a boy with jam on his chin, laughing, and placed it in the mailbox. Not as a gesture of forgiveness, but as an offering to the version of him who had not yet learned to be ashamed of his origins. Then I walked away, not quickly, not dramatically, just steadily, the way one leaves a room when the conversation has finally ended. The bus station was crowded, the air thick with the fatigue of travelers who had already begun to forget where they were going. I bought a ticket to Portland, but the woman at the counter asked if I wanted the flexible fare, and I said yes, because perhaps I wouldn't go all the way home. Perhaps I would stop somewhere else, somewhere smaller, quieter, a town that didn't know my story. On the bus, I sat by the window and opened the blue notebook one last time. I wrote, "There is a kind of love that survives only when you stop begging it to return. I have reached it now." The wheels began to turn, and the city receded, and with it, the life that had once mistaken me for a burden. As the bus crossed the bridge, I looked down at the water below, dark, rippling, indifferent, and thought about how strange it is that freedom and loneliness can feel identical at first, until you realize one moves forward and the other circles back. I closed the notebook, held it against my chest, and whispered a small prayer, not for my son, not for forgiveness, but for women like me who have been trained to disappear gracefully. May they one day learn that there is no grace in vanishing. There is only the quiet power of staying visible long enough to choose when to walk away. The bus hummed through the miles with the steady patience of something that has seen every form of departure. I stayed awake as the landscape unfolded, not because I was restless, but because I wanted to remember what it felt like to cross distance without being pursued. Through the window, towns flickered and disappeared. Gas stations, faded barns, children waiting at bus stops with backpacks almost as large as their hope. And with each passing hour, I felt my body adjusting to a quieter rhythm, one that belonged to no one but me. I wasn't returning to Portland in any ceremonial sense. I was simply returning to myself. It's strange how the act of leaving can feel less like an ending than like breathing after years of polite suffocation. I had thought freedom would roar, but it didn't. It whispered, steady and persistent, like my own pulse reminding me I was still here. When I reached the city, the air was thinner, colder, and the familiar smell of rain on concrete welcomed me with a tenderness I hadn't expected. My apartment stood exactly as I'd left it, humble but honest, every scratch on the table a record of having lived. I made tea, sat in the chair by the window, and watched the light shift along the opposite building. The phone blinked twice with missed calls. Daniel, then an unfamiliar number that I didn't need to check to know belonged to Carla. I let the silence between us stretch. There are absences that wound, and there are absences that heal. This one felt like the second kind. I unpacked slowly, laying each thing in its place as though I were repopulating the world with intention. The 2 notebooks went onto the shelf beside the dictionary my husband had given me decades ago, the one where he'd written on the flyleaf, "To Mary Ann, who names things truthfully." I hadn't opened that book in years. Now I did, tracing his handwriting with my thumb until the ink felt warm again. The next day I walked to the community center where the housing trust operated. The woman at the front desk, middle-aged with kind eyes, greeted me as if she already knew who I was. "You're the donor from Connecticut," she said. "We received the transfer this morning." I nodded, feeling a strange lightness. She led me to a small room where they kept files and photographs of families the fund had helped. Women and children in modest apartments, standing by stoves, smiling not with triumph, but with relief. She pointed to one picture of a young woman holding a baby beside a window with yellow curtains. "This will be one of the homes your contribution supports," she said. The room in the photograph was modest, its walls slightly cracked, but it glowed with that unmistakable intimacy of spaces built from survival rather than aesthetics. "Do you know where it is?" I asked. "2 towns away," she replied. "She's moving in next week." I stared at the picture, at the way the light fell across the woman's arm, and I felt something close to peace, not the fragile peace that depends on someone else's approval, but the durable kind that comes from doing something irreversible and right. In the weeks that followed, I built new rituals around ordinary life. I joined a book club at the library, though I rarely spoke. I baked for neighbors who didn't know my story. I even began volunteering twice a week at the same community housing office that now bore my name on a small brass plaque near the entrance, the Cross Foundation, in honor of shared beginnings. It made me smile every time I saw it, not because it immortalized me, but because it made the building harder to erase. People there called me Mary, and I didn't correct them. Sometimes a smaller name feels lighter to carry. On evenings when the city was quiet, I walked by the river and thought about Daniel. I imagined him pacing his perfect kitchen, the children asleep upstairs, the house somehow feeling colder despite its perfection. I wondered if he would ever drive by one of those homes the trust supported, if he would recognize in their windows something that used to belong to him, a warmth, a humility, a kind of light that doesn't need to be named to exist. One evening, months later, a letter arrived. The handwriting was unfamiliar but careful, almost formal. It was from Daniel's oldest stepson. He wrote that he had found some old family photos while organizing boxes, that he had seen the deed transfer in a stack of legal mail, and that he finally understood, in his words, how much history can fit inside a signature. He said he hoped I was, well, that the baby, my biological granddaughter, had begun to speak, that she'd learned the word home before any other. At the bottom, he had added, I think she'll want to meet you someday. I held the letter for a long time, reading it again and again, until the paper grew soft where my fingers rested. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was recognition, and that is often the greater mercy. That night, I dreamed I was standing again in Daniel's house, but it looked different, no longer sterile or polished. The walls were bare, the furniture gone, and sunlight spilled through the windows, unfiltered. I walked from room to room, touching the walls, leaving faint prints like proof of having been there. Then I stepped outside into a garden, wild with overgrown grass and small, stubborn flowers that had pushed through the cracks in the path. The air smelled of earth, raw and alive. When I woke, I understood it was not a dream about loss, but about reclamation. Things grow again when you stop controlling their shape. Spring arrived quietly. The city trees began to blush with new leaves, and I started knitting a blanket from the leftover yarns I'd saved over the years. Each color carried a memory: a pale blue from Daniel's first baby sweater, a deep green from my husband's old scarf, a stubborn orange from a sweater I never finished because life interrupted. I worked on it every evening by the window, not as a metaphor or a legacy, just as something that kept my hands busy and my heart aligned with the rhythm of making. One afternoon, a neighbor from down the hall knocked to borrow sugar, saw the blanket, and asked if it was for someone special. I said, yes, for whoever needs warmth next. Sometimes, when the sun sets and the air carries that quiet that only comes after rain, I think about the long chain of women who walked before me, mothers, grandmothers, the ones who swallowed their hurt until it turned into silence. I like to imagine them sitting beside me now, watching the river, nodding in approval, not because I found justice, but because I found my own ending. I think they would understand that recovery is not loud, that it rarely comes with applause. It comes with breath, with paper signed, with peace that does not need witnesses. And if I could speak to another woman like me, the one who still waits by the phone, or who hides her intelligence so as not to upset anyone, I would tell her this: do not vanish politely. The world will never apologize for overlooking you, so stop apologizing for being seen. Keep the documents, keep the proof, keep the recipes and the photographs, and one day, when the quiet feels unbearable, remember that you can walk out of any house you helped build, and the walls will stay standing, but you will finally move. I learned this late, but I learned it completely. My son may never say my name with pride, but the earth, the ordinary ground I walk each morning, knows who I am, and that is enough.